Couple of quick Lucy Letby updates for you, because you may have seen in the news there are two things. First of all, the police have now announced that they are doing a wider investigation into the Health Trust and the people working for the Health Trust to see if there are any offences that may be applicable there. And I'll come on to that momentarily. Also, Lucy Letby's legal team have applied to the current inquiry that's going on and saying, well, look, this should all be put on hold now because this week we are going to submit our case to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. And everything should be put on hold until we see what they do. So what are the chances of success on that one? I'll deal with them in reverse order. It's difficult because, of course, it's up to the chair of the inquiry if she decides that she thinks it is appropriate to put this on hold. My guess is, though, that she won't. Some of that will be for practical reasons, like witnesses will have been warned, there's a big timetable there, there's a schedule, they're employing people, to do all the admin for the length of this. They're all on contracts, effectively, or they're being paid to do this inquiry. And now that's all in place. I think just the sheer inertia of the system will mean that will stay in place. Also, even though the CCRC thing gets in, it'll take quite a while for the CCRC to process that, even if they get this in this week. Obviously, this is quite an important case, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I know it sounds awful, it's a priority because, she's on whole life tariffs. So to put it very crudely, it's not like she's going anywhere anyway, is it? I can understand people go, well, if she's innocent, she should be dealt with as quickly as possible. But of course, the CCRC has a lot of cases on, and by definition, everybody applying says that they are innocent. So, can somebody jump the queue? And it may be they'll say, well, no, we'll just do them in the order that we have received them. So I think it might be quite difficult. So I suspect that the inquiry will sort of plough on in the background. It'll be interesting, though, because, of course, what happens, if the CCRC refer this back to the Court of Appeal and the Court of Appeal come to a different decision, overturn the convictions or order a retrial or something. We'll just have to wait and see. But yeah, my prediction is that the inquiry will just go on ahead. But what about the other issue that they're now looking at, the police are looking at prosecuting, effectively members of the trust? Well, there's two things. They can actually prosecute the trust as a whole because although NHS trusts aren't technically corporations, by statute, they do fall within the remit of something called the Corporate Manslaughter and Homicide Act. It's got two titles because it applies to both England and Wales and Scotland, and down here we say manslaughter, and in Scotland they say homicide. But once you get over that, the law is the same for both places. And what does that do? Well, first of all, it allows you to prosecute organisations. You've always been able to do that, but the old test was what we call gross negligence manslaughter. That's the old common law offence. And people spotted problems with that because they said to convict on that, you had to find one controlling mind. You had to find one person within the organisation at senior management who you could sort of fix the blame on. And as so often with these sorts of cases, it's a bit like what we call the Swiss cheese model. There's lots of slices with holes in, and if they all line up and you can put a pencil through, a series of holes, the idea is that you're supposed to have checks and balances so that there's one slice where a hole doesn't line up and that stops things happening. But the argument here is, well, it was very, very difficult because it's like, well, you've done something wrong, but none of the things that people did wrong in themselves were particularly egregious, but all added up, they amounted to a systemic failure. So that was a problem. You could also prosecute individuals for gross negligence manslaughter, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But the idea for the Act was you could just look at the system that was in place. Now, it still looks at the decisions of senior management. They do say that organisations such as health trusts should not be responsible if somebody at a lower level, if ultimately it's all down to them, then they say, well, it doesn't sort of bring in like vicarious liability like you'd have in civil proceedings. They say because, this is criminal. So obviously, the test and the thresholds are a bit higher. And it'd be very interesting, because would it be a defence to say, look, this was all, Lucy Letby. This was one of our relatively minor, not senior management employees, so that gets us off the hook. So you'd have to look at, were there significant failings that, put her in a position where she could do this? But we always say, you can build systems, you can protect against incompetence, but you can't protect against malice. So I suspect that will be cropping up a lot as their defence. Also, they could still go after individuals for gross negligence manslaughter, but that's a very high test. And to give an example, it's usually easier to do it from a medical thing. Let's say a surgeon makes a mess of an operation and somebody shuffles off this mortal coil. Well, if it can be shown they have been negligent, then there is a potential civil claim against them. And actually vicarious liability would come in there. If they were a surgeon employed by the NHS, then the NHS would be liable for the negligence of their employee or their subcontractor, as they sometimes do it. That would be, that just aids in recovery, because obviously, the trust has more money than an individual surgeon might have. But mere negligence isn't enough to turn it into the criminal realm. So, we don't prosecute surgeons every time they get something wrong, even if people don't survive. We just sue them. However, gross negligence is where it falls so far below the standards that we expect from people that it crosses the threshold into criminality. And interestingly, although that sounds like it should be a matter of law, and indeed it's up to the CPS to initiate proceedings, so they look at that, and then it's up to the judge to decide, because some people might say we'd apply to dismiss this case because there's no case to answer. As a matter of law, what they've done doesn't amount to gross negligence. But ultimately, courts tend to say, it's a matter of fact, gross negligence. Whether somebody is negligent, it's a matter of fact. And this is what's interesting. The old offence very much leaves things to the juries, where there's the new statutory offence. The judge has a bit more to say in that. So say, for instance, the very simple fact of, did the defendant owe a duty of care to somebody, to the deceased? Under the common law, it was for the jury to decide whether a duty of care was owed. Under the new Act, it's for the judge to decide whether a duty of care was owed. So that's a slight difference there. In practice, that won't make a difference, because it's always been held that sort of, trusts and, NHS trusts and hospitals and individual medical practitioners, of course, they owe a duty of care to their patients while they were in their care. So yeah, I mean, the trust did have a duty of care to these children. So I don't think, in practical terms, it's going to make much of a difference. But yeah, like I say, it's a very high threshold, though, even under the new Act. But they would look at this, and they would look at systemic failings on behalf of the trust. Now, obviously, being a trust, what's the penalty? It can only be a fine, and ultimately it all comes out of the taxpayer's purse anyway. In terms of justice, is that really justice? But what if they go after any individuals? Well, like I say, they could theoretically go for people for gross negligence manslaughter if they can find that individual person, whether it's a manager or a supervisor or an administrator or the chair of the trust, can you say you did something so egregious that you personally should be liable? But of course there are other offences as well. There may be Health and Safety Act offences. You've got to provide a safe system of work and a safe system for delivering to your customers, your patients. So there may be lesser offences that they can look at. So I've done a few videos generally. If you just search, I've done a big sort of deep dive into the Corporate Manslaughter and Homicide Act. So you could have a look at that. But what's the chances of these? Well, we just don't know at the moment. I mean, it's always very difficult when it is somebody who's gone rogue, as they would say, because ironically it would be easier to prosecute if she had just been negligent. Because it say, well, your training is inadequate, your supervision is inadequate, your systems for making sure that people don't make mistakes are inadequate, or for picking up on them afterwards. Maybe you should have said there should be some supervision, somebody should sign off on decisions, somebody should always be, supervising the nurses while they're on the wards, all that sort of thing. But they also do take into account things like just, business efficacy. And of course the NHS isn't a business yet, but, it still has a budget, and courts are very reluctant to interfere with managerial decisions. Where it's, what systems have you put in? How are you spending this money? I mean, there's a rather strange thing, actually, just to go on a little diversion, but it is relevant, that when it comes to things like gross negligence and corporate manslaughter, they sort of do put a value on human life. You say, what is the value of a human life? And this comes in with railways and highway maintenance. And if it's a case of, well, we could put this system on a train that would make these trains slightly safer, less likely to go through red signals or something like that. They actually look at how much would it cost versus how many lives would be saved on average. And it's interesting, I think for railways it's a slightly higher value that they take into account. They go, well, if it's going to cost you more than like £2 million per life, that's probably too much. Whereas, similarly on the highways thing, it's like, how much would it cost to sort of, make this motorway a little bit safer, or to put some safety barriers? Because obviously sometimes it might be, I'll plug the great channel Auto Shenanigans again. And there is a button specifically for that. Unlike John, who's brilliant, I don't ask for subscribers, because I'm just grateful for you watching these things. But he's done loads of great videos about why dangerous motorway intersections exist and dangerous, road junctions, and it's because of the history and cancelled projects and running out of money and all that sort of thing. And they do take that into account. It's not the thing to remember about sort of negligence, whether it's civil claims or criminal prosecutions. You are not guaranteeing safety, perfect safety. I mean, they've said that in road traffic cases. Your duty is not to provide complete safety to other road users. It's just to be reasonable in the amount of safety you provide. And that's the same for like the Highways Agency or the rail network. It's not a counsel of perfection. It's what is reasonable in the circumstances, taking into account things like budgets and finance. So when we say, what price on a human life? Well, actually, as far as the law's concerned, there is one, and they take that into account. So yeah, I'll keep monitoring this and see what happens. I mean, again, it's interesting because the inquiry is rumbling on, and the inquiry is looking at the wider systemic issues. And we come back to this thing that it's quite unusual for an inquiry to take place before the criminal prosecutions. I mean, they waited until after they prosecuted Lucy Letby before having the inquiry, but it may be there's that it could have been, and say, well, actually, if we're going to be prosecuting other people, it should all be put on the back burner till then as well, because now that they've announced that they're going after people, well, what if they're witnesses at the inquiry? Are they all going to exercise their right to silence? Because they can do that in an inquiry. They can, if they think they might be prosecuted, they're perfectly entitled to say, I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that it may incriminate me. And that's, like I say, usually that's why we have the criminal proceedings first and then the prosecutions afterwards. Compare and contrast to the Grenfell inquiry, which Theresa May deliberately had done the other way around. She said, have the inquiry first and then we'll look at the prosecutions. Interested to see in the comments your views on that, as to whether inquiry should do first or criminal trial should come first. I mean, you can see the point is, because first of all, if somebody's being prosecuted, they shouldn't be hanging around waiting for 10 years to find out if they are going to be prosecuted. But there's also just the practicalities that it's generally considered better to have the criminal trial so that you can see what happens, rather than the inquiry where, like I say, people may exercise their right to silence or say, I'm not disclosing that material because that would prejudice my trial, or things like that. So there you go. I'll monitor both of these. But like I say, my prediction is the inquiry will continue. And also, it'll be interesting to see what the police come up with. It wouldn't surprise me if there were some sort of prosecutions for relatively minor offences, some health and safety breaches, some regulatory breaches and things like that. But I think it would be quite hard where, it's a situation like this where one person, allegedly, as far as the law is concerned at the moment, because she has been convicted, where it's all pinned on one person, making their decisions. And, arguably there's not a lot they can do, because it's not like you could just basically follow every nurse around all the time, double teaming just to make sure they're doing their job properly. So my prediction is on that one that, there may be some prosecutions for health and safety type regulatory offences, but I can't see that they'd bring a corporate manslaughter charge. So there we go. As always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely informative, vaguely accurate. I'm indoors today because, first of all, I'm just stacked with work, so I've just taken 20 minutes off to do this video. And also, it's just blowing a hoolie outside. While the weather is very, very sunny, it's very, very cold, and it's just so windy. Even I thought about just popping out somewhere local just so you'd have a tree in the background or something, but the tripod was, I don't think the tripod would have stayed up.